Welcome to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. My name is Doreen and I'm the Education Director, and I will be your host this evening, as well as Sharon will be the other host. And thank you for coming out on our first official summer evening. We never know who, it's open to the public. Sometimes there'll be 7, 8 people, sometimes there'll be 100 people, and we have to turn them away and say we'll plan a second night. So thank you for coming on such a beautiful evening. And I'd like to introduce to you Professor Richard Hutto, who is the director of the Avian Center at the university and professor of ornithology. And he has been doing bird stuff for over 30 years. He can tell you more about that. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Isn't there an avian unit out here at the lab? At the fort?
A flight lab out here.
The flight lab, yeah, so that's different. The flight lab is Brett Tobalski and Ken Dial work with bird flight out here at the old officers' quarters that's been remodeled, and that's where they do. He's done a lot of interesting stuff on the evolution of flight and that kind of thing, having their birds out there. I'm pretty much on campus, except when I'm out in the field. So June is usually the month I try to be out as much as I can be. And so what I wanted to talk to you tonight about is sort of link a little bit to the 1910 story, the 1910 fire story, but to try to throw a different perspective. And I tend to be, way off on the one end, just to try to tweak people's minds enough that they think differently about things maybe than they had thought before. So usually the kind of description of the 1910 fires, this interpretive sign of the Forest Service, here in August 1910, the area was ravaged by huge forest fires, and 3 million acres were devastated by the 1910 fires. The way I want to try to change your perspective is to have us appreciate that these kinds of events, these are natural. They've occurred forever. And so at the time when these things are burning, it's devastating and destructive and dangerous, and they're heroic stories, the Pulaski story and all. But once it's over, it's not any of that. It's just a process that has finished, that normally occurs through time, and it's very similar to other kinds of disturbances. The things we're seeing this year, oh my gosh, whether it's Arizona burning up, or whether it's Missouri flooding, or eastern Montana flooding, hurricanes, you name it. These things are all natural events. They've occurred forever, and so there's a whole area in ecology called disturbance ecology that seeks to understand the significance, the ecological significance of these disturbance events. And so the 1910 fires are certainly one of those kinds of major events, but when you look at it from the perspective of disturbance ecology, it's nothing out of the ordinary. It hasn't happened before. It wasn't anything that could have been prevented either. So when you think about disturbance ecology, a disturbance event usually always involves death. And probably, sometimes people argue that a tropical forest, a tree falls and new vines and things grow up underneath, and that's a major disturbance event. But usually we're talking about many, many, many individuals dying, plants and animals, enough that the whole nature of the community changes, and the names of the things you see on your little checklists of plants and animals and things change. And that's when we get to what I call disturbance. So when it's that significance, you have a really important disturbance event. So there's all kinds of characteristics of disturbance: magnitude and patchiness and extent and timing and frequency and those sorts of things. And it turns out that certain combinations of these variables tend to occur together, so that often you'll see high frequency events be fairly low in their severity, that kind of thing. Especially with respect to fire, usually people think of the range of kinds of fires that burn at any particular place on Earth as belonging to, somewhere along this continuum, a high severity, infrequent sort of occurrences, or very frequent and low severity occurrences, where the understory kind of burns very frequently every half dozen years to a dozen years, something like that. Here we'd be looking at every 1 to 2 to 300 years for the event to come. So there's sort of this kind of regimes. These regimes exist depending on what you're talking about. California chaparral is this kind of regime. The Australian eucalypt forest is this kind of regime. Rocky Mountain forests are mostly these two. The Arizona that's burning up right now is more this sort of regime. We think that historically it was tended to be a lower severity understory sort of fires dominated the picture. And so over time, in the last 100 years since the fires of 1910, people had begun to think that largely, Jim Habeck sort of started some of this up here in this part of the world with studies in Panty Canyon. And the botanists began to see that, it seems like there's been a change in the composition of the forest in the last 100 years or two or whatever. And there's more young trees now than there were before. The stands seem to be stocked pretty heavily, that kind of thing. And I'll show you the little picture illustrating that kind of, the kind of data that people like Habeck used to determine this. Then there's sort of the mixed fire regime is thought to be largely unchanged over time. Yeah, basically burning the same way it always has. And then the super high severity infrequent events, haven't been affected much at all by whatever we've been doing in the last 100 years. But the lower elevation open ponderosa pine forests are thought to be burning differently than they did in the past. And this comes from tree ring studies where you have, trees are growing and they get injured at some point when they're little things like that, 10 centimeter DBH thing. You may have a bunch of duff at the base and burn the edge of the tree. It gets injured. And so it begins to heal that wound and the scar tissue grows over. But before it completely heals that wound, doggone if another fire doesn't come and shoot. Now you get another injury there. And then it begins growing over that, and then another one burns, and then another one burns. Anyway, you can add up these fire events and know how many times a fire occurred at that particular spot on the ground. And so if you do this across lots of different trees in an area, you can tally these events up. So these are all different trees, and every tick is when it got burned. And you can see if you go from the 1600s to the 1700s to the 1800s to the 1900s, lots and lots and lots of fires until about 1900, 1910, fires, that kind of thing. And then, geez, most of these trees aren't leaving a heck of a lot of signatures anymore, which is kind of interesting. Something weird happened around the turn of the century where we don't seem to be having as many fires, certainly in these low elevation, open, dry forests that leave these kinds of signatures. And the story usually goes, well, doggone, maybe we've been excluding fire for such a long period of time. Oh shoot, by doing this now the understory is growing up, we get a bunch of young trees, and now when a fire event comes along, whoa, it becomes a really uncharacteristically high severity event. One thing I'd add to the story is that it's probably not fire exclusion that's the primary thing that led to changes in forest composition. That's probably, when reading the literature these days, that probably accounts for a tiny proportion of the change in forest stand structure. Much more important are things like timber harvesting, primarily. And look at out here in the 60s and 70s, everything was slicked off. That is much more important in determining changes in forest composition than fire suppression. Cattle grazing, climate change, there's lots of things. Whatever. We're thinking humans have done something to change the system so that now it burns in an uncharacteristic fashion. Now, one thing that's interesting to me is that this story seems to have been applied broadly across all forest types, probably too broadly. And so the people that first came out with this idea after it left here, Missoula, with Jim Habeck, the real champion who's carried this in the last 20 years or so is Wally Covington down at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. And so, the kind of papers he writes, he'd say things like helping Western forests heal, implying that all forests, have this issue or this problem. They're growing in ways that are unnatural. Historical changes in forest systems in the inland West. But when you look at the data, it turns out only about 15% of all the western forests in the United States are this low elevation, high frequency, low severity fire regime. Everything else, 85 to 90%, is not that. And so there's not a lot of evidence that things are all that out of whack for most of the forest types, and probably not much of the stuff that burned in 1910 belongs to this story. You know, it's stuff that's always burned at high severity infrequently. Not in our lifetime, but, you know, last 300 years, sure, there was one, another fire event or two. So I was going to say, it's interesting, fuel buildup, for example. You're not going to make that argument for the 1910 fires. You know, we weren't doing fire suppression before then. It's a natural event. It's climate. You got a dry year, you know, after 2 or 3 years. That's the kind of thing that leads to these sorts of events. So, unfortunately, the public at large doesn't get that sort of message that these kinds of severe events are actually natural occurrences. And, you know, we're sort of beaten over the head with the idea that things are way out of whack if this sort of thing happens. So when this kind of fire burns and leaves this as an aftermath, and this is pointing right out here, 5 miles away, Black Mountain. Here's a picture of Black Mountain after 2003. And the Missoulian, you know, the kind of words that come out are, it's, you know, horror, disaster, devastation, destruction, crime, scar, you know. And it's really interesting when you look at this particular forest type, that kind of event is not all that out of whack. Same with Yellowstone, which is a totally high severity, infrequent fire regime, by and large, the kinds of fires that burned there historically. And the newspapers had all these words associated with that fire. And there were calls for the resignation of the superintendent of the park and the head of the Fish and Wildlife, Internal, the Department of Interior. It's like, it was crazy. The press just went nuts over this, saying it was somebody's fault. Somebody did something wrong, you know. So the ecology hasn't really gotten into the mainstream yet. And the kind of words, here's the Forest Service interpretive sign. These are the words that we put into our signs. It was a fire that ravaged the area and devastated the forest. You know, you could write the sign saying the forest was restored in 1910. You know, it just depends on your perspective. So that's the point of my talk, is to try to really tweak, you know, our perception 180 degrees and just make you think maybe something you hadn't thought before. So the thing that's interesting to me, consider that these severe fires are the ones that cause significant enough change ecologically. You get a change in the names of things that are there. The plants you see, the flowers you see, the mushrooms you see, the birds you see, the mammals you see are different. You need to have a severe enough event to get that change. If you have a mild understory burn, you go back and look at your checklist, it's just like what was there before. This kind of fire gives you change, and what does that do? Well, that gives you what the process called succession, which is change in the composition of the forest community over time. And if you don't have disturbance events, you don't get all these different cool stages of succession from early post-disturbance to later post-disturbance. You know, when are you going to get your grasses and shrubs and seedlings and pole sapling stage and young forest? And you got to have a severe event. And for most forest types, these events are part of the whole story. So we're cutting forests these days to restore them to what we think is open, you know, understory, mild, kind of low severity fire regimes. But because it supposedly mimics natural disturbance, but you wonder how natural that sort of thing is for forests in this part of the world, the Northern Rockies. We may need to go back to square one if we really want to mimic natural processes in these forests. And that means not just understory burning, but severe burning as well. So the forest managers, the district rangers now are kind of struggling with, they're moving toward this sort of view, but it's a struggle, you know. How do you tell the public, hey, by the way, I'm going to let this thing go, you know, and hope your barn doesn't burn down, but this is a natural process, and the severe sort of flames and 100-foot and 200-foot flame, that's part of the deal. But they're working on it, and I think the way it's going to end up is probably we'll spend more time and energy at the urban interface, clearing things out, thinning things, you know, to be more like this this picture, And as you get farther and farther and farther from the urban interface, begin to understand that we need to just let these go and appreciate that that's a natural sort of process. We'll see how that evolves in the next 10 to 20 years. So the question I had when 1988 came along and Yellowstone burned up was, gee, if these kinds of fires are really natural events, and they always have occurred through time, there ought to be things that have evolved to occur in those and maybe even depend on them, maybe be restricted in their distribution to these situations. And so I use birds as a tool, and I thought, let's look at birds as a biological indicator and see if there are any that sort of are associated with these sort of severely burned forests. Or are these devastating, destructive biological deserts? What do you see if you go out into a burned up, char-broiled forest like that? You know, is there life out there? And so if you go and listen to birds, you know, you can just stand at one point and there's an olive-sided flycatcher, and there's a siskin, right? Oh, there's a junco. There's, everyone knows, a robin. You know, what's cool about birds, there's a woodpecker, a flicker. What's cool about birds is I can stand at a point and in 10 minutes give you a list that's pretty darn accurate of what occurs in that area. And then move to another point and get another sample. And move to another point and get another sample. And do hundreds of these points. So we did this after 1988 fires, and what we discovered was they are not biological deserts. Our list was, this is like 2 pages long, 100 species or so we detected in these burned up Yellowstone and other places. And that was the first thing was, wow, there's a lot of life in there. And not only that, over half those species on the list, we found nests out there in those burned forests. It's not like they're just passing through and we got them on our count. You know, they're out there, they're using it, they're nesting there. And then the thing that turned out interesting is some of the species seem to be relatively restricted to burned forests. And how do we know that? Well, you've got to know whether they occur in other kinds of vegetation types. And how are you going to know that unless you spend your life running around every vegetation type in the existence? Well, you can go to the literature and mine the literature for information from bird surveys that have been done. And so I did this, and there's like 6 or 8 vegetation types: grassland, sagebrush, riparian, aspen, mixed conifer, spruce fir, thin forest, clear cuts, and burned forest. And just tallied up the number of studies that said these different birds were present. And you see robins are in a lot of different vegetation types, right? Yeah, I mean, come on, where don't you see a robin? Well, sagebrush and grassland. Everywhere else, they're abundant. But what was interesting, nowhere were they more abundant, according to this literature search, than in burned up forests. You want to see a robin? Go to a burned up forest. But even more impressive was, so there's a bunch of species where they're most abundant in burned forests. I think there were 15 species that fell into that category. And some of them are relatively restricted to burned forests, meaning the literature at least said they didn't occur anywhere else. And blackback woodpecker is the champion of all. That was the most extreme species. And so people, you know, looked at these data and said, oh brother, these literature reviews, that's so sloppy and you miss so many vegetation types and this and that and everything. And so about 20 years ago, we started what's called the Northern Region Land Bird Monitoring Program with the Forest Service here in the Northern Region. And now we have 18,000 points scattered all throughout northern Idaho and Montana using exactly the same methods. We've been everywhere. We've stood in parking lots, we've stood on alpine meadows, you name it, we got data for it. And now if you take the real data with systematically collected similar, it's exactly the same result. We weren't deceived by that literature search. We were onto something. About the only place you see this blackback woodpecker is burned forest. Yeah, occasionally you see one. In fact, most of these observations, when you do the GIS analysis and look, there's usually a fire nearby. And so it's a pretty impressive bird. And then the last few years, we've gone out into some burns like the Black Mountain and others here in western Montana to ask, okay, I'm convinced that blackback woodpeckers are associated with burned forests, but where in these burned forests? You know, which particular severity? And so if you look at a map of a burn, there's very severely burned stuff and sort of medium brownish burn and not very heavily burned, you know, light, low severity. And so you train a field crew to go out, they're hotshot birders, And they classify the land according to the severity, being low, medium, medium high, or high, which corresponds really well with these severity maps the Forest Service has after fire. Those are actually pretty darn accurate, those maps. And then you ask, where were the black-backed woodpeckers? And where do you think they are? What do you think? Yeah, it's weird. I'm telling you, it's weird. and it's not like we did this 14 times in 12. And I mean, the sample size is 300, 300, 300, 600, 1,000. I mean, we're covering ground. There's no database as large as this in the world in fire. They're out there, and they're mostly high severity patches within the burn. So not only are they in forest, they're in the high severity burn stuff. And then some people, there's always people who are going to figure out a way that, oh, no, you messed up somehow. And so one of the complaints is, oh, well, you don't detect them here where there's more vegetation. You detect them out here. They're really in here. They're probably more abundant here than they are there. And it's like, oh, God. So you do playbacks. You take your field data recorder. Here I have one here. And you go to black-backed woodpecker. And you simply play it like this. And if there's one around, they respond to it and they get pissed off and they come in at you. And so you can do this, you play this in the field. And so if they're out there, even in green forest, they'll come in. So if you do the playback information, there's the results. It's even more dramatic. If anything, we're deceived by having fewer than we thought out here. So yeah, they like the severe stuff. And people have known about this for a long time anecdotally. Not scientific sort of studies, but just anecdotal, these bird watchers. Here's an article in a magazine from Ontario, the Ontario Naturalist. And the thing is, in this particular article, just what were 20,000 uncommon black-backed woodpeckers doing there? This article about this guy who claims he's seen more blackbacks in one day than any other human on the planet ever. And he's probably right. He said he saw 175 black-backed woodpeckers driving this road up through Ontario, through a fire, through a severely burned. So anecdotally, it's like, whoa, that should ring bells. And even 100 years ago, in the Birds of North America accounts, this guy, Manly Hardy, wrote Major Bendir in 1895. Specimens were so abundant in fire-killed areas that I shot the heads off 6 when I was short of material for stew. So, the evidence was there, not the sort of rigorous, objective, scientific kind, but we should have caught on a long time ago. There's something special here. And when I look at this bird, the longer I've been doing this, after about 20 years, I've just beginning to really appreciate this bird much more now. I look at this bird against a black tree, and that is as impressive to me as this ptarmigan against snow. I mean, I don't doubt for a minute that the evolutionary history of this bird and natural selection, picking and choosing among individuals, favoring those that happen to match a background, is just as powerful here as it is there. And it probably reflects that long history, and it's not something that's sort of a opportunistic movement into burned forests. I mean, it's tied to those things. It's screaming fire. And what do they do when they go in there? What's the whole story here? Well, the beetles get the trees. So the trees die, but the wood's good. The outside's the charcoal, basically. Inside's perfectly good wood. So these wood-boring beetles come in before the fire's even out and lay their eggs, and then the larvae take a couple of years to develop. And you can see how big they get, and it's just scrumptious eating. And so the woodpeckers come in, not just blackback. Blackback's just the most extreme. Every woodpecker in western Montana goes into these areas and just has a heyday because there's so much food. And then, after 3-4 years, game's over. The life cycles of the beetles are gone, and all the magic's out. And then, it gets more dead. I'm up here, it was up this morning in Black Mountain, 8 years after the 2003 fire, and doggone it, there was a blackback up there, still hanging there. I'm going, what are you eating here? There's no more, there's more onto the edges now. I think getting more of the bark beetle larvae instead of the wood-boring beetle stuff. But
they have to tweet to find the next place to go?
No one has yet found one moving from one fire to another, but they must do that. Tweet. The biology of the beetles is probably, it just leaves the woodpeckers in the dust. There's this beetle called in the genus Melanophila, black lover, And they have on their thorax here, if you blow this up with a scanning electron micrograph, they have this infrared heat detecting device. They can detect heat for up to, in the Science article in 1964, up to 100 miles away. And that was the extreme, commonly 50 miles. So they can detect heat. And they're honing in. These beetles are flying into these areas before the fire's even out, as I said, because there's a lot of competition to get those eggs in those trees and compete and produce offspring and that kind of thing. So the beetles are all about these fires as well. Then there was an article just in 2006 in Science about longhorn beetles. And these longhorns apparently are smoke detectors. These things can detect tiny concentrations of smoke in the air. Very tiny concentrations. So there's all kinds of tools these insects have to find these fires and get in there, lay eggs, and be successful themselves. So there's a lot of cool biology going on with these things. So if we don't lose our lives and houses and things, there's a lot of cool stuff that happens with these fires. But you can see the conflict. I mean, I'm not going to go down to Arizona and say, woohoo, this is cool. There's no way. You have to kind of wait maybe 6 months and say, hey, this is pretty cool, as long as everybody's still safe and that kind of thing. So that's what we as humans have to begin to understand. You have to understand how to live in a world that is a disturbance-based world. It is about disturbance. It is about death and destruction. These are natural events, and we have to learn to live with them. And that means probably not putting our houses up every canyon, all kinds of things. Probably not putting our house on an earthquake fault, or not on the Malibu Canyon, or there's just common sense sort of things. There's going to be taking into concentration here. We're going to now look at this forest, and here are trees that have been fed upon by woodpeckers after the beetles come in. So in a year or two after fire, this is what all the trees start looking like, because the woodpeckers have pounded and dug in there and pulled out the beetle larvae. And here is a little video of a blackback, see if this works.
This is the hero of our story, male blackback woodpecker. Jet black on the back with a brilliant yellow cap on top of his head.
Cute little guys.
Used to be called the blackback three-toed woodpecker. I can even see here with these 10-power binoculars that there are.
He only has 3 toes. It doesn't have one pointing down, it just has 3 toes. I mean, it's so weird. So it and there's a second species called the American three-toed woodpecker, are the only 2 three-toed woodpeckers. And they're both fire kind of oriented birds. So it's a little poster bird. So, and I was going to say, yeah, it's not just blackback. If you take data on other species, this is called a three-toed woodpecker. It's very much like the blackback, but it has white on its back. And it also is at least twice as common in fire as anywhere else. It's just a little more specialized on the shallower bark beetle larvae instead of the deeper wood-boring beetle larvae. But otherwise, they're very similar. So the three-toed is more likely to be in the beetle outbreak areas, for example. Blackback's not as likely. Blackbacks are pretty well tied to fire. Then, so here's the three-toed. It also likes, relatively severely burned portions of the fire. Here's hairy woodpecker. Come on, they're your bird feeders. They're everywhere. They're in town. Yeah, they are, but nowhere are they more abundant than in a burned forest. That's where they're more abundant. And they too, look at that. The hotter it gets, the more likely you'll see them. Flickers. Come on, they're everywhere. They're all over. They're outside the door here. Yeah, but look at the abundance in fire. They're way out here with seed tree cuts. They love those sort of open, disturbed conditions, and they like it hot. And this one's a really neat one. People love bluebirds, and they put up bluebird boxes to try to save bluebird populations. Well, wait, what do they naturally use? And what they naturally use in this part of the world is fire. And they are really impressive. Look at the mountain bluebird, and it's the toastiest stuff is where those things occur. They nest in the snags that have holes, the cavities that are built by the woodpeckers, and then they love to pounce on grasshoppers and things until the understory builds up enough that it's not economically good to be foraging there anymore, and then you don't see them as much. They're still really common at Black Mountain, though. Whoa, whoa, whoa. They are thick at year 8. So this was just to say, I hope I turned, your head upside down. Get you thinking a little differently about fire than the stories that you normally read. And I think the bottom line is this kind of environment, this backdrop is the evolutionary backdrop against which that thing evolved undoubtedly. And therefore, if we want to maintain some of the variety of life on Earth that requires this sort of thing, we have to maintain this sort of environment too. And not be so upset when something burns up. So the implication is, it's not that many organisms are able to survive fire, it's that they may require fire in order to survive, which is pretty neat. And most of the data coming out these days, particularly Baker out of Wyoming, demonstrates clearly in the northern Rockies, fires are not anywhere out of the range of natural variation for most of the forest types here. I'm not going to get into this, pretty neat though. Even ponderosa pine, there are a lot of data coming out showing that high severity fire events are not out of the ordinary. How frequently? Still really infrequently. You're going to have a heck of a lot more low severity understory burns than you are high severity ones, but there every 100 to 300 years you're going to have a high severity event too. So even in Arizona, unprecedented, they say in recorded history, but recorded history is what, the last 50 to 100 years? But if you go back to the 1700s or the 1500s or 1400s, there's evidence of 500,000 acre fires, even in Arizona. So infrequent, not common, but it's there. But the way we've been trained is, these kind of fires are bad, 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 bad. So the public's been led to believe, ooh, I found that on the web. I don't know who did it. I just thought somebody did it. So, yeah, the Colgan picture. So when a fire burns like this, like the Bitterroots fires, this was in 2000, don't you think with this sort of education that we'd all be dancing in the streets? I mean, Missoula's close. If there's any city in the United States of America that is close to celebrating a severe fire event, Missoula's probably it. But that's only because all the school kids have been brainwashed now for 10 years by all of us running around trying to give them a different perspective on the whole thing. But we don't, and we don't celebrate these events because we consistently are trained to believe that they're bad, they're negative. And so, here's the kind of posters you find. This shameful waste weakens America. And then Smokey comic book. If you haven't seen one for a while, as Smokey grew up, he had something to tell folks, and he still tells them the same thing. He tells them how he hates forest fires, how they destroy his animal friends, how they burn up timber that could have been used to make homes, perhaps a new home for you, how they could waste wood that could have gone into furniture, or even make paper to print comic books on. I mean, it's true, they do that, but there's more to the forest than trees. You have to look beyond the trees to see the forest sometimes. And there's a lot more diversity in a forest than just trees for pulp. And here's one on 3rd Street by the Good Food Store, just a couple of years ago. I mean, it's like here we are in 2011, and we're still getting banged over the head with the same messages. This is a Forest Service poster. Unfortunately, they can't run for their lives, the trees. And, to an ecologist, it's like, what? They've been waiting for that event for 150 years. That's their reproductive success, is that event. And so it's just interesting. It's really a different perspective. So I went on just before I came here, hour ago, Smokey Bear page. You won't find anything that's good about fire except prescribed fires. Prescribed fires are good fires. Everything else is bad. We're trying to reduce the hazard of catastrophic wildfire caused by excessive fuel buildup. That's the story we're getting. And they have this little counter, tick, 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 that counts. It's like sort of the population clock, where you see human population going, 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 going. It counts the number of acres burned. So it's a very negative, it's not celebratory. It's like, woohoo, yet another acre, yee-hee, great, No, it's, oh my God, if we don't prevent this stuff, we are in bad shape. So it's really interesting. And it's worldwide. So if you go to Mexico, you get the same story. Here's a little squirrel, Zona Forestal Apaga del Fuego. If you don't put out the fire, the squirrel's tail's gonna catch up. It's like, you can be anywhere in the world. It's all on some chromosome, we're all trained to hate fire. And of course, as soon as the fire burns, then the Missoulian's really entertaining. Of course, it's always entertaining. There was an article in the New Yorker about the Missoulian editorials, and, yeah, and that was about saying how entertaining it is. All those guys, they can't even put a gas station on the corner. They're going to have a whole series of letters. But anyway, this was after the fires of 2000. You know, people who say fires are good for the forest are disregarding catastrophic fires that burn so hot and deep the ground's sterile, won't rejuvenate. These are the folks using junk science we're supposed to embrace. That's me. Now, the burn snags left standing are in no way good or healthy. Well, you know, I say he's wrong. He's wrong. They are. That's part of the forest. That's part of the health. That's a healthy forest to that blackback woodpecker. And to many, many other things, or the beetles, or the morel mushrooms, or whatever. And so when this sort of event occurs, because we've been getting that one-sided story, and I'm of course giving the extreme other side, but whatever, just trying to swing the pendulum a bit. So when it happens, of course, what do we want to do? We want to, 89.5% when they did a survey in the Bitterroot said it's important to salvage timber, so 90%. So if it's a landslide election in a presidential year, like when it comes up here in a year, if somebody wins by a landslide, it's going to be 52% to 48. Here's a place where 90% of us agree on something, and it's we ought to get in there and get that wood out because there's no value in there otherwise. That's why we have the word salvage. We're trying to salvage what little value there might be. So, outside national parks, this is the kind of thing we do. Less than in the past, but still considerable. Australia, 2009 fires, they're cutting the heck out of the stuff. Canada, they're cutting the heck out of the stuff. Now the last, I saw in Arizona, of course, all the senators are going to head right to introduce a bill to expedite salvage of the wood. And so it's interesting. You have to ask yourself, wait a minute, isn't the aftermath of the fire the thing that all these species have specialized on? And don't they need that stuff? And the answer is yeah. If you collect data and go into areas that have been salvaged like this, and you look at the birds, here's a bunch of cavity nested bird codes, letters for bird codes, and you look at salvage logged and unlogged areas. In every single case, the salvage log is less than the unlogged. Salvage less, salvage less, salvage less, salvage less, salvage less, salvage less. There's not one species that benefits from salvage log, not one. It's 100% negative. And so if wildlife biologists were ever in a position to influence policy, this is a good example where we have some real data. But yet, I'm telling you, just wait 2 weeks. We're going to see bills introduced to Congress to expedite salvage. And then we even give brownie points if you use salvage timber. So here's an MSNBC page here where this home in New Mexico, the Schriffels home, comes from timber harvested following a forest fire. And so they get an eco-friendly stamp of approval. It's really interesting. So I'm in a really fun area politically because I can be a strange sort of outlier. So one might ask, wait a minute now. Global warming is supposedly happening. Fires are becoming more frequent. What are you all worried about? A. B, we don't really take that much in salvage logging anyway. These days you go to the Forest Service, go to the Lolo, and they're going to salvage something. It's 5 to 10% of what burned. What's the big deal? What's the problem? And here's the problem. Yeah, we don't take a lot, but here's the outline of the perimeter of the 2007 fires at Seeley Lake. Here's Placid Lake, here's Seeley Lake. Here are places that the district ranger put aside slated for salvage. And here's a model of where we think blackback woodpeckers are, so you can build little models of where it's good and bad, because we now know what they like and don't like based on the timber base and based on the severity of the burn and that kind of stuff. So the darker the green, the more likely there are blackbacks. And so there's the salvage, blackback, salvage, blackback, salvage, blackback, salvage, blackback, salvage, black. They fit like a glove. Yeah, we're taking 5%, but it's 95% of what the most fire-dependent things need. So it's head-on conflict between us and our needs for wood, apparently, and the needs of others to carry out their biological existence. My argument is always, there's plenty of places to get wood. Burn forest should be the last place we go. I should be introducing legislation to make sure we don't go in to the salvage log. There's plenty of green forest. There's plenty of timber out there. It's not like we have a problem finding wood. It's just that we have this mentality that it's a negative process and that there's no value in it, otherwise we may as well salvage a little. And it's ridiculous.
So can you wait 5 years till they've gotten all the market and then go in?
Yeah, that would be it would be better in a number of respects, but the wood loses its value. There's the problem. So from the industry perspective, it's like, sheesh, I got to get in there fast because the wood's going to check. The beetles are going to get in. I'm going to get stained. I'm going to get, yeah. So it really is a problem. I think we just have to decide what we value, and is the only value in the forest a tree, or are the ecological values outside the value of the wood tied up in a tree? And so all these things, whether it's morel mushrooms or hollyhocks or Bicknell's geranium or these beetles and woodpeckers and bluebirds and western boreal toads, they all, they closed the North Fork Road in Glacier Park for these toads because there were so many of them crossing into the burn. And so there's lots of biology going on. There's more to the forest than the trees. That's not the place we need to be in there mucking around, because we tend to mess it up, I think, more than fix it up when we go into these burned up forests. So now I guess the perspective I want to leave you with is just when you see a burn like that on a hill, you might consider it a beauty mark as opposed to a scar. And that's kind of the story. And so what I'll do is I can show you a little slideshow if you want. It lasts 3 minutes. You want to see it? If you want to see a longer one on your own, this is really good. This is a master's student at MSU who put this together. It's called Disturbance, Jeremy Roberts. Really good. So it's Forest Service, and then I get a bunch of time in there yakking too, so that was kind of fun. And it's 19 minutes long, and if you go on, Vimeo, V-I-M-E-O, Vimeo, and just type in Disturbance, you'll get it.
We also have it here. If
Okay.
you're interested, I could
Yeah, CD kind of thing, yeah. This is real. The Vimeo thing's great. It's like, it doesn't jiggle, and it's not like looking at YouTube or something. It's a really high quality. That's a neat one. It's showing this new perspective, and a lot of Forest Service personnel talking about kind of new views. And then the other one, this thing, I just put together with a bunch of my own slides. So everything in it is a picture of something in a severely burned forest. And then I thought, oh, gee, I'll put together a slideshow. And this music, when I was at a movie by Mark Cohen, seemed perfect to me. And so I said, wow, I think I'd like to use that music. But then I got the copyright problem. So at the time, I think I phoned New York and got his manager or whatever. And I'd like to use that song as a backup for a little slideshow I'm doing. Guys looking at the phone, I can imagine, God, I got a kook from Montana on line 3. Anyway, they gave me permission, so I got away with that. So I'll show you that, and then that's basically it. A lot of people have helped funded our work over the years, including timber companies. But so let me show you this, and then we'll have time for any questions you might have. Here, I think this should work. That was Lolo. That was at Lolo Creek, 1988. That's Black Mountain there.
How many roads you've traveled?
My kids.
How many dreams you've chased? Across sand and sky and gravel, looking for one safe place. Yeah, yeah, one safe place. Yeah. Will you make a smooth landing when you break your fall from grace?
Can you name the birds?
Yeah, it's pine siskin.
Into the
There's
arms
3-toed
of
woodpeckers,
the
Glacier Park. That was really cool.
looking for one safe place.
Everyone knows that. Robin.
One
Lupin.
safe place.
I mean, even these mass flowering events are just magic. Chipping sparrow, yellow-rumped warbler. Morels.
Oh, life is trial by fire.
Was that Glacier?
Yellowstone.
It's the sweetest taste.
Cowbirds.
And I pray
Lodgepole pine adaptation, just throwing those seeds up at the top, waiting for a fire to get them up there to disperse. Western tanagers. Robin nest.
One safe place. Yeah.
Blackback. No problem. Epilobium. Fireweed. Really shows up after fire. Disturbance in general. Black bear. Castilleja.
How many
It's a
roads?
red-breasted nuthatch, the little one that goes beep, 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 beep. Ooh, uh-oh, bluebell?
How many
Is that right?
dreams we
Okay.
chase?
That great gray and glacier. Just walk right up to him and burn.
Across sand and sky and ground.
Mountain bluebird,
We're looking for one safe
hyliated.
place. Yeah. One safe place. Yeah.
Human?
So there's their one safe place.
One safe place.
Different perspective. Flashback bunting. Dark-eyed junco. So those are just some things you can see. So it's an uphill battle, but it's fun. All right.
What movie was that from? Do you remember?
Oh, darn it. I can't remember. I had that.
It's a beautiful song.
It is. And then we were just sitting there, my wife and I, of course, I was thinking about fire, and it's like, I think I like this song. It's funny. Yeah.
I had the opportunity to just go driving through down the bitter road. The fire after hit. I mean, right after. The trees are still smoking. Everything.
Yeah, the 2000 fire.
Or, I don't know when it
Yeah.
was, but those blackbacks are not very big.
You know.
Are they that big?
Yeah.
There was a little black bird in there. No idea what it was.
Yep.
And
I have to be there. Don't know.
it seemed to be small.
Yeah.
It might have been bigger.
If it wasn't on the side of the tree banging his head against then it would be.
Of the trees and they
Oh.
were all over.
Oh, sounds like a little, what's called a pygmy nuthatch. I don't know. I just don't know.
I
I'd
don't
have to be
know,
there,
but
yeah.
I'm thinking, now how do they
Yeah.
know that there was a fire?
Well, there's a good question.
Get there?
There's a good question. You know, and personally, I would say for the birds' perspective, I mean, they see in ultraviolet and we don't very well, and there could be interesting signatures across the landscape with the blacken may be very visible to them, A. B, it's not hard for us in August to just twirl around like this and see a column of smoke. I mean, there's fires everywhere. Every year there's fires. And so it's probably not that difficult to play this sort of hopscotch game and just be a dynamic, you know, mosaic kind of movement. But there's been a lot of blackbacks banded. We banded over 60 and have yet to see one who's moved from one fire to another. So it's still speculation. Nobody knows. They emerge up out of the dirt, or they must move around. And so there's some. Vicky Saab is doing some radioing, and so is a guy in South Dakota, in the Black Hills. There's a weird little population of them there, and so maybe they'll get lucky with the radios and be able to follow one that moves. But so far, don't know. Yeah.
So I totally follow you on the benefits of severe fires, but what about burns like the Yellowstone fires,
Mhm.
where what they say decades and decades of fire suppression led to unprecedented
Yeah.
severe burns? How does like suppression play into
Yeah.
that kind of severe?
In Yellowstone, most the people that work there that are the fire ecologists say it's not even close.
Okay.
Suppression hasn't done anything to influence what's going on in Yellowstone. Certainly it has affected the Targhee and other areas adjacent, which you could argue then affects the park. But by and large, I think most of the fire ecologists say it had nothing to do. What's neat is if you look at global climate variables and big infrequent fire events, they fit like a glove. It's weather. Get dry years, you get big fires. And yeah, it's really, that explains 90% of the variation. There's some of the variation explained by suppression and fuels, especially in the lower elevation forests. I think people pretty much are on board there in the Flagstaff area, and where the largest extent of ponderosa pine forest is. And blackbacks don't get down there. I mean, it probably wasn't that big a deal with high severity forests. It burns down there, but Yellowstone, that's nothing compared to 1743, and nothing compared to 1442 or whatever the other. There were events there, 1.5 million acres. It's nothing. Canada, that's nothing. Yeah, this 500,000 in Arizona. Yeah.
If one can get three or more hundred years worth of fire history down, graft and so on, as I did in Patty Canyon, I found some trees that predate the Indians acquiring horses in 1730.
Yeah, that was pretty neat.
And you find out that all the forest fires, starting from lightning ignitions or from occasional Indians still without horses, but after they got horses in 1730, the cross sections of the fire-scarred trees show these very frequent. The fire scars are close together, and then after 1900, 1910, you have this lengthy no fire kind of a history that's recorded in the tree rings. 100 years, if you cut it down today or so. Now there's two words you used, Dick, and you only used them once in the entire presentation. Urban interface. Now, when you were talking about the Black Mountain Fire, but then there's the Black Cat Fire where people racing out of their homes from Evero, guess where the TV and the news journalists were talking to those people, they weren't talking to you. And then the fire at Cedar Lake, that was more of, well, Cedar Lake survives. It was always the people. And if you fly into Missoula over some of these mountains, you see, you shift from an area that's a mosaic, sort of a shifting mosaic, kaleidoscopic change from all sorts of things, sometimes logging and sometimes past fire occurrences. But then all of a sudden you see a house and a little tiny road going up into it. And then all of a sudden they call 911 and say, my house is being threatened. And then you get something like the Evero situation where people are told to get out and stay out. And
it's always going to take precedence. Yeah, it's always going to take precedence, and I think the only solution is to try to minimize that so it doesn't take over. And the way to minimize that is, things we don't like, like zoning. Like at least requiring people that are going to live in risky places to take the risk and not make us all pay for it, because we're all paying for it. And so,
they don't give them insurance, they can't build, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing. So if you're wealthy and you want to take a risk, and you want to build on California Mudslide Hill, you take the risk. Don't have us all pay for it.
Floodplains the same way.
Floodplains same way. Oh my gosh! This year I can't help but bite my tongue, going, "Oh my, who let that development in there?" Is what you have to ask yourself. I mean, this is a 100-year flood event. But city councils tend not to decline development. I mean, it's personal property right kind of thing, and this is one of these. Whoa, this is such a touchy thing. Do we need government telling us what we all as a group ought to agree to?
I have a question about the pine bark beetle and so much of the kill. Is that bringing in some of these bird populations before there's a fire?
Not the blackback.
Not the
So we spent an entire year going all over western Montana and beetle outbreak areas and we did find one. And then, but three toads, yeah, more three toads, Harrys. So the other woodpeckers take advantage of those beetle outbreak areas. Yeah. So there's something going on, but it's not the same kind of magic. Just nothing, you know, it's not like, you're not going to go there and find morels. You're not going to go there and find cool wildflowers. You're not going to go there and find bluebirds. You're not going to go there. Nah, not much evidence that that's the case. So once those needles fall very rapidly, the fire risk probably declines. So it's the plot of fire risk actually goes up fast, but falls very, very fast. So, you know, these are things people are constantly publishing on and arguing back and forth about, but it's not very clear. You know, but most of the data suggests it's not increasing fire risk. But there's probably some sort of synergism and cycle that those things eventually going to burn. And are they going to be as good a forest after fire in terms of the post-fire response of something like a blackback? Because the trees are already dead, they won't get as much of a beetle response. It may not be as good as a green tree forest that burns. So there's a lot of neat questions like that that we just don't know the answers to those. Yeah.
I expect that the museum would take advantage of the fact that the School of Forestry, College of Forestry on the campus is celebrating its 100th anniversary next year. And one would think that that would take up at least a nice room to show how they used to use all sorts of strange things that were slide rules and so on, and all sorts of sticks and measures that it would be interesting to have exhibits of how they did this. I would point out that after 1900, many of the first foresters that came to North America were not trained in, there were no schools of forestry. And so the forests out west needed to be managed. And where do you think the guys got their training? Germany. And what was the philosophy after Germany, who's had a 1,000-year history by 1900 about the forests around it?
Let's get out the vacuum cleaners and clean the understory.
They have a forester for each tree practically. And then of course they came out, and of course this idea of fire being bad and so on was translated to New England and then the Lake States and so on, and came out west. So, and then finally, the other idea is that in 1973 I did participate in data collection that led to allowing wild ignitions to actually run their course in that million-acre Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and lessons have been learned. And in the Frank Church Wilderness just to the south, they've been having all sorts of problems with smoke generating that comes to Missoula because they didn't adopt that kind of a philosophy. Well, casually let it burn is the term, but it's management fire. And it turns out that the ranger at Moose Creek, when he was contacted, that he had all sorts of fire, but he was just sitting around with a notebook and pencil. Those fires from 73, there was sort of a spike of a lot of fires, a lot of acres burned, but finally they've reached, just in 2009 or 8 and so on, that they don't get uptight about any ignition in the Selway Bitterroot. And it's not, the smoke coming into the Missoula Valley is from some of the Idaho wildernesses that still have not come online, although they're coming online to burn this mosaic and so on. I'm not sure about the Bob Marshall, but anyway, it's so slow, and
yeah.
I don't know if people in the audience would think that you've criticized the Forest Service via Smokey Bear.
Yeah, I criticize the message. Yeah, I criticize the message. Yeah, I think the marketing is, well, the Forest Service grew basically as a timber protection and production organization. The schools of forestry did too, and this school of forestry has evolved so much in the last 100 years, especially in the last 10 years. I mean, it is not about so much growing trees anymore. It's about managing ecosystems and managing forests, recreation. There's a lot to do that forests provide us besides the wood. The wood's in there too, yeah, but it's not such a concentration now on the wood production. It's something we'd like to be able to have sustainably forever and use it in a way that, because trees grow, but not in a way that we were doing in the 50s, 60s, 70s that clearly was not sustainable. So that kind of change in the schools of forestry, you can see nationwide probably with the exception of Oregon State. No.
Most of your photography is taken during the daytime, so when you and your crews are in sleeping bags at 1 to 3 a.m. in the morning, where are those black packs?
Yeah, they're in holes, in their nest holes, roosting.
So they excavate cavities and they're feeding young.
Mm-hmm. But they go in those holes, and they have other roosting holes too.
Because that point wasn't really emphasized, that they are actually going through a reproductive phase, and that's where more black packs come from.
Yep.
What do they ever double clutch or?
Not that I know of. Most birds, if they lose a clutch early due to predators or something, may re-nest. Most birds will do that, but not right. Not like the juncos that do, 2 to 3 clutches. Yep. So yeah, they're raising young in there, and then the holes, of course, become useful to bluebirds and tree swallows and house wrens and all the other native cavity nesters. And the more and more holes that are created over the years. Now, year 8, like I said, up in Blue Mountain is pretty amazing. The holes. I mean, geez, it's like house wren city up there. Jeez, another house wren.
How do the birds detect that there is something worth digging for? Because these things are within the wood.
Well, I didn't play the clip of the beetle eating the wood underneath the bark. If you walk up to these trees and after it heats up in the middle of the day, you can hear the beetles chewing the wood underneath. And then if you just move up to the tree, they'll still be. But if you touch that tree, they shut right up. Then you move back, then you put the tape recorder thing up again. They begin. So a bird landing on a tree, just sitting for a minute, can probably hear what's going on. But then they probably also have, some ability to detect the sound.
Not vision, obviously, but I have seen.
But pitch, you do see pitch holes. Yeah.
Turn their head.
Yeah.
Is that
like robins hearing? Yeah, I don't know, or listening, or looking, or yeah. No, all these mysteries. I don't want to answer. We can't answer them all, or else everything will be solved. No. Right. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.